There is a library, we might say, of documents written by Christian leaders in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, non-canonical documents. They're not a part of the New Testament. But these documents give us a good glimpse into the first 200 or 300 years of Christianity. A number of these documents are referred to as the Apostolic Fathers. And one of those documents is an anonymous apology, and most scholars believe that this particular document was written in the mid-2nd century, so around AD 150, and it's simply titled The Letter to Diognetus. And I want to begin this morning by reading one chapter from this letter. For the Christians are distinguished from other men neither by country, nor language, nor the customs which they observe. For they neither inhabit cities of their own, nor employ a particular form of speech, nor lead a life which is marked out by any singularity. The course of conduct which they follow has not been devised by any speculation or deliberation of inquisitive men, nor do they, like some, proclaim themselves the advocates of any merely human doctrines. But, inhabiting Greek as well as barbarian cities, according as the lot of each of them has determined, and following the customs of the natives in respect to clothing, food, and the rest of their ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as if foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. They marry, they beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men and are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are in lack of all things and yet abound in all. They are dishonored, and yet in their very dishonor are glorified. They are evil spoken of and yet are justified. They are reviled and blessed. They are insulted and repay the insult with honor. They do good, yet are punished as evildoers. Yet those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. This so-called letter, again, an apology, a defense of Christianity, is obviously dependent on 1 Peter, especially our text for today, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 through 17. So I hope you brought your New Testament this morning, and if you did, please be turning to that text, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 through 17. So this morning, we continue our series of sermons titled The Christian and Politics. In looking over the previous 3 lessons, I would remind us of key texts from each of those lessons. In lesson 1, Philippians 3 and verse 20, the words of the Apostle Paul, "But our citizenship is in heaven, From lesson 2, the words of Jesus in Matthew 22 and verse 21. So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And last week in lesson 3, from Romans chapter 13 and verse 1, again from the Apostle Paul. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. So this morning in lesson 4, the Christian in politics, we want to hear from Peter. And what Peter has to say in our text this morning is very similar to what we saw Paul say last week in Romans chapter 13. And so this morning, in looking at 1 Peter 2, verses 11 through 17, we'll kind of follow the same pattern, if you will, that we did last week. First of all, I want to look at the context of 1 Peter itself, so we can kind of understand what is going on with Peter writing this letter to hopefully help us better understand our text for this morning. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1 tell us that 1 Peter was written to churches scattered across the ancient Roman provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, which is now Turkey. These churches are suffering, not the empire-wide persecution that would eventually come, but just general abuse, harassment, and discrimination by a suspicious, resentful, and hostile public. Concerned about this local persecution, concerned about the suffering that these Christians were facing, Peter writes to these secluded cluster of churches to do at least 5 things. Number 1, to provide hope in the midst of their suffering. Number 2, to assure these Christians of their place in God's kingdom. Number 3, to challenge these Christians to be holy. Number 4, to convince them to live as members of that kingdom through, rather than to capitulate to the surrounding culture. And number 5, to convince them that their salvation is secure in their faith. There were 4 areas of life where these disciples were called upon by Peter to engage before the watching non-Christians of their culture. And it was from these watching non-Christians that they were beginning to have to endure this suffering, this persecution, this alienation from their culture. Well, in our text this morning, Peter begins by discussing our behavior in civic life. Then, at the conclusion of chapter 2, he discusses behavior in households as Christian slaves with non-Christian masters. In chapter 3, he discusses marriages of a Christian with a non-Christian spouse. And then this middle portion of 1 Peter, it concludes with Peter especially mentioning the suffering and relating it to those volatile circumstances where Christians appear to have been singled out for discriminatory treatment. So again, this letter was written to a cluster of churches in ancient Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, somewhat secluded from what we might call the rest of the brotherhood, all alone, somewhat by themselves, and they were beginning to suffer because of their faith in Jesus. Well, in the first couple of chapters, Peter really encourages them by reminding them who they are as God's people. That God has not forgotten them. God has not neglected them. He is with them. And so we come to our text this morning, 1 Peter 2, verses 11 through 17. Another text that hopefully can help us as Christians living in a culture, and especially in the context of an election year, to help us better respond as God's people to the political process that we find ourselves in. So I've divided this text into two sections. The first being verses 11 and 12, where Peter shares our identity and our mission as Christians. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. So as we begin to think about the Christian in politics and this word from Peter, he begins by giving us an identity and giving us a mission. As far as the identity is concerned, he uses two metaphors which could be summarized simply by strangers. I'm reading from the NIV this morning, and it reads foreigners and exiles. And again, both of these words could fall under that wide umbrella of strangers. The first word, foreigner, literally means someone who lives beside your house. And so it's referring to a stranger who remains in a place different from his or her origin. So it's like living in your home and strangers from a different place, perhaps a different country of origin, or they may just be from southeastern Oklahoma. That'd be strangers. I can say that because that's where I'm from. Right? And they move in beside you. Okay? That's the word, that's the implication with this first metaphor Peter uses. The second word that the NIV translates as exiles, which in my opinion is not a good translation, literally means someone who lives beside others, a stranger who has no intention of remaining. Right? So you have in the first word a stranger who begins to live beside you, and in the second word, a stranger who's just kind of passing through. Right? The point again being strangers. Neither type of stranger was given full legal or political privileges. Both were vulnerable to the suspicion and fear of the local people that their strange and peculiar ways posed an ongoing threat to the common good, and in this first century pagan context, and the favor of the local gods. Discrimination along legal lines were accompanied by countless forms of social discrimination, disparagement, scapegoating, and public shaming. So Peter gives us this identity because we belong to Christ, because we wear His name. We can appear strange to the pagan culture. And we live our lives in such a way that can be threatening to the general public. That's who we are. That is our identity. But he also, understanding this identity, gives us a mission with two imperatives: to abstain and to live. Okay? To abstain means to hold oneself apart or away from. to avoid, to stay away from, to steer clear of. Well, what are we to avoid? Well, fleshly desires that wage war against our souls. That's the negative side. But the positive side, though, is to live. And the word translated live there means to have or to hold a certain form of behavior. And we are to do good. Whatever is good, whatever is beautiful, whatever has the appearance of what is virtuous. Right? So there's the two commands that then lead to this one mission. And it's to be seen. Now, think about that for just a moment. Our Christian lives are to be lived publicly, where people can see how we live. Christian life is to be inspected. Right? The King James reads, to live which they shall behold. Kind of like that language. Right? Our lives are to be seen, to behold by those among who we live. Now, the last phrase in verse 12 in the NIV reads, glorify God on the day He visits us. Literally, it's on a day of visitation. And I am convinced by New Testament scholar Peter Elliott that this particular phrase, as it's generally explained or understood, is not necessarily the second coming of Jesus, that day that God returns. Right? I believe and have become convinced that it is an occasion when an unbeliever is confronted with the attractive behavior of a Christian. And we can have that kind of impact. Again, our lives are to be seen. They're to be inspected. And upon inspection, seen to be different, virtuous, good. We simply respond differently than the general culture. We act differently when we are mistreated. We do good. Or, as we like to say around Alameda, we make Jesus known through our lives. And by the way we live, by the way we conduct ourselves. So this text begins, again, with this idea of giving us a sense of identity and a mission. Well, the text continues in verses 13 through 17 with Peter then giving some implications for our public lives. He says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Now let's unpack this a little bit. Some implications again because of who we are and what we're supposed to be doing. Right? Implications for our public life. Number one, Christians are to submit to the governing authorities. That's exactly what we read Paul saying last week from Romans 13. Peter uses the same word, submit or subject. And it simply means to order yourself under. It's a choice. And Peter goes on in this text to say it's a free choice that we make. The word human authority there, that we are to submit ourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. The word authority is literally creature. And some of the older translations bring this out. Barney, it goes exactly back to what you said in your song selection this morning. Recognizing God as creator, and we are creatures, the created. And so the translation creature, I think, is consistent with the identification of God as creator. Here's what Peter Elliott, who I quoted a moment ago, here's what he says about this particular verse. In connection with emperors and governors, human creature has a particular understanding. With this expression, imperial power is subtly but decisively demystified, desacralized, and relativized. In contrast to devotees of the imperial cult who render obedience to the emperor as Lord and God, Christians respect the emperor and his representatives only as human creatures. Do only the deference owed to all human beings. We'll see that in verse 17 here in just a moment. Ultimate supremacy is reserved for God the Creator, and it is because of Him, the Lord, that Christians are subordinate or submit. And Peter says we do this for the Lord's sake. It is because Christ, not Caesar, is Lord that one submits. This phrase also limits submission, for submission can never be to anything Jesus does not will or expect of his disciples. And Peter makes the point, because we're doing it for the Lord's sake, we are submitting as an example to others. Peter, as we read in this text, does exactly what Paul does in Romans 13. He identifies the role of government as punishment and commendation. Now, you might remember if you were here last week, Paul goes on to add, if you don't want to worry about getting in trouble, then obey the law. Common sense, okay? And Peter is alluding to the same type of thing. So Christians, verses 15 and 16, must engage in appropriate behavior. It is the will of God. It exposes non-Christian ignorance, and Christian freedom can then be appropriately used. And so this text, again, emphasizing as strangers our conduct in civic life with four little maxims, we might say. Peter says to honor everyone, to love the family of believers, to fear God, and to honor the emperor. It's interesting, even though the NIV doesn't show this, that honoring everyone and honoring the emperor, it's the same word, same idea, in how we treat those around us. So, with this text in mind, 5 points to ponder this morning, 5 lessons to learn, 5 takeaways. Number 1, our identity is to be noticeably distinct. We're to be different. How do we respond when someone cuts us off at Walmart as we're trying to check out? Or how do we respond when someone cuts us off in traffic? How do we respond when we are unjustifiably mistreated at work? How do we respond when things are not going well for us? Those are the times. And those are the points of emphasis that I think Peter is making here, where our lives are to be noticeably different. And at least in our society generally, you retaliate. You seek revenge. And to not do those things is kind of strange, right? How do we respond when we lose a loved one? We grieve differently because of the hope we have in Jesus. So we are to live strange lives in our culture and in our society that's different from the way culture generally responds. So number 2, our lives have an inevitable social dimension by which it is judged. Remember our mission. Our mission is to be seen, to behold, be beholden by culture, to be inspected so that it can be shown to be different. And in that sense, judged. Number 3, suspicion and even discrimination can be expected because of this distinction. Now, fortunately, we live in a country, even though it appears more and more as time progresses, our country is ignoring traditional Judeo-Christian values, and it does seem like our lifestyle is being more discriminated against. But it's even worse in other countries, okay? So this can be expected. In fact, Peter writes, if we continue to study this book, he almost suggests that if you're not suffering because of your faith in Jesus, maybe your faith in Jesus is not at the level it should be. Right? So number 4, Peter declares in this text, honorable behavior can reverse public opinion about Christians. He encourages us that our lives can make a difference. And if you've been present for previous lessons in this series, I've shared some statistics which suggest that those who claim to be Christians, our behavior, especially when it comes to politics, has not always been admirable. Right? And so particularly during a political season, when tensions are so high and the issues are so important, that how we respond and how we treat others, particularly those who disagree with us, right? When people see that, it can make a difference. Now, we either believe that or not. The power of the gospel, the power of Jesus, that we can reverse public opinion, and quite honestly, it needs to be reversed, at least according to a lot of the surveys that are being done. So, number 5, and I worked really hard on this one. So, woo. Woo stands for win others over. That's pretty good. It's pretty good. Okay? Just go out when you go to work, when you go to school, as you associate with friends, just think, woo. Live your life in such a way that you can win someone over to Jesus. All right? Now, there's a word, I don't use this word often, and in fact, I had to look it up. But the word is winsome. winsome. We don't use that word in Pontotoc County. I had to look it up. But it's an adjective meaning sweetly or innocently charming. It means to be engaging. It means to be appealing. It means to be captivating. So our lives, again, even though it can be a little strange to some. It's a life that is to be seen. It's a life to be witnessed. We don't seclude ourselves. We don't go hide. We are engaged publicly. We are engaged politically. In our country, we have that opportunity. But as we engage, we display just some different attitudes. We look at things a little differently. We respond in different ways to life and to life's circumstances. And so we respond in such a way that others look and say, you know what? That's a pretty good way to respond. And we are winsome. Our life is appealing. It's captivating. And we just woo somebody. We win others over to Jesus. Scott McKnight, in his commentary on 1 Peter, concludes his discussion of this particular text with this. Peter shows us that the Christian's relationship to the government is ultimately not a final relationship. Christians are free because they have been redeemed. The state's authority over them is secondary, and their submission to the state is secondary to their submission to the Lord. Christians are to be good citizens because they are obedient to the Lord. Not good Christians because they are obedient to the state. To do the latter is to put the cart before the horse. Our ultimate loyalty is to King Jesus. King Jesus. And yeah, sometimes that means our lives may be a little strange. But our purpose through our lives, through our walking, through our talking, how we respond, it's to make Jesus known. And when others see us, hopefully they see Jesus.